Do you know that Thomas Edison was afraid of X-rays? Yeah, not electricity, not fire, X-rays. And when you know what happened inside his laboratory, that little fact becomes much more disturbing. In 1903, a reporter asked Edison about X-rays, these strange new rays that could pass through your body and show the bones underneath. And Edison said something that sounds almost unbelievable coming from him. "Don't talk to me about X-rays. I am afraid of them." Why was he afraid? Because he had watched what they did to one of his own workers. His name was Clarence Dally. Dally was a glassblower from New Jersey who worked in Edison's laboratory. He helped build the early X-ray tubes. And because nobody really understood the dangers of X-rays yet, he did something that would be unthinkable today. He tested them on himself, again and again, for years. At first, nothing seemed wrong. Then his hands started to change. The skin became damaged. The wounds wouldn't heal. Eventually, he lost his fingers, then his hands, then his arms. And in 1904, Clarence Dally died of cancer. He was just 39 years old. Now, to be fair to Edison, he didn't deliberately sacrifice Dally. That's not what happened. The danger of repeated radiation exposure simply wasn't understood at the time. But Dally's story is one of the darkest chapters in the early history of radiology. And to understand it, we need to go back to the beginning. Clarence Madison Dally was born in 1865 in Woodbridge, New Jersey. He came from a family of glass workers. His father worked with glass. His brothers worked with glass. And Clarence became very good at it. That mattered because, in Edison's world, glass was everywhere. Light bulbs were made of glass. Vacuum tubes were made of glass. Experimental electrical equipment depended on skilled glassblowers who could make incredibly delicate tubes by hand. In 1890, Clarence joined Edison's laboratory in West Orange, New Jersey. A few years later, his brother Charles joined him. The two brothers became trusted workers in Edison's laboratory. Then something happened in Germany that changed everything. December 1895. A physicist named Wilhelm Conrad Röntgen was experimenting with cathode ray tubes, and he noticed something strange. A screen in his laboratory was glowing, even though the light from the tube shouldn't have been able to reach it. Röntgen had discovered a new kind of radiation. He called them X-rays. And then he did something extraordinary. He put his wife's hand in the path of the rays. The photograph that came out showed the bones inside her hand. Think about that for a second. Until that moment, if a doctor wanted to know what was happening inside your body, there were very few options. Now, suddenly, you could look through the body without cutting it open. The news spread incredibly quickly, and it reached Edison's laboratory. Edison immediately became interested. He hadn't discovered X-rays. Röntgen had. But Edison saw the potential. His laboratory started experimenting with the new technology. One of the things Edison worked on was the fluoroscope. Instead of taking a photograph and waiting for it to develop, you could look directly at a fluorescent screen and see the X-ray image. Edison experimented with different materials for these screens. Calcium tungstate produced a much brighter image. And once again, Clarence Dally was involved. Dally and his brother were building the glass X-ray tubes. Tube after tube. They would build one, test it, change something, build another, test that one. And the problem was, nobody knew how dangerous this work was. There were no radiation safety manuals, no dosimeters, no exposure limits, no lead aprons hanging on the wall. Nobody had yet figured out that the invisible rays passing through the body could also damage the cells of the body. So when Dally wanted to know whether one of his X-ray tubes was working properly, he often used his own hands. He exposed them to the radiation. Then he did it again, and again, and again. It wasn't one massive exposure that destroyed his hands. It was repeated exposure over time. The damage accumulated quietly. And then, slowly, his body started telling him something was wrong. His skin became damaged. Lesions appeared. By around 1900, the injuries had become so serious that Dally had to take time away from the laboratory. Edison eventually realized that the X-rays were responsible. He later described the effect on Dally as having affected him poisonously. But by then, the damage was already severe. In 1902, a lesion developed on Dally's left wrist. Doctors tried to treat it with skin grafts. It didn't work. The disease continued. Eventually, his left hand had to be amputated. And then the same thing happened to the other hand. Ulcers appeared. 4 fingers were amputated. But it still didn't stop. More operations followed. Eventually, both arms had to be amputated. Think about the cruelty of that. This man had made his living with his hands. He was a glassblower. His hands were his profession. And the very technology he helped build destroyed them. Then came the final stage. The cancer spread. On October 2nd, 1904, Clarence Dally died. He was 39. Edison had seen all of this. And Edison himself had been exposed to X-rays. He had spent years experimenting with them. He later had serious problems with his eyesight and said an eye specialist had told him his vision was a foot out of focus. Edison believed he had escaped the worst of it, partly because he had used weaker tubes than Dally. But after Dally died, something changed. Edison stopped working with X-rays. The man who spent his entire life chasing new technology suddenly wanted nothing to do with this one. He later said he was afraid of X-rays. And not just X-rays. He was also wary of radium and polonium. He didn't want to monkey with them. And honestly, you can understand why. Because Edison had seen the consequences with his own eyes. Today, radiation safety seems obvious. We use shielding. We keep our distance. We minimize exposure time. We monitor occupational dose. We use dosimeters. We don't put our hands in the beam just to see whether a machine is working. But none of this was obvious in 1895. Radiology was brand new. The rules had not been written yet. And people like Clarence Dally paid the price while those rules were being discovered. That's the part of radiology's history we don't talk about enough. We remember Röntgen. We remember the first X-ray. We remember the incredible images. But behind those images were people who were being exposed to something they couldn't see, couldn't feel, and didn't yet understand. Some of them were badly injured. Some lost their hands. Some lost their eyesight. Some developed cancer. And some died. Clarence Dally was one of the first Americans. He wasn't a famous scientist. He didn't win a Nobel Prize. He didn't have a university named after him. He was a glassblower, a worker in a laboratory, and his name might have disappeared completely if not for what happened to his body. But his story matters, because every time a radiologist steps away from the beam, every time a technician checks a dosimeter, every time an X-ray room is shielded, every time we ask whether an exposure is really necessary, we are using lessons that people like Dally helped teach us. Lessons learned the hard way. Clarence Dally died in 1904. But the story didn't end with him. There were many others, people across Europe and America who worked with X-rays and radioactive materials before the risks were understood. Their names are preserved in a memorial in Hamburg, Germany. They are sometimes called the radiation martyrs. And in the next episode, we're going to meet them. Because Clarence Dally was only the beginning. And the story of those early radiation workers is one of the most remarkable and unsettling stories in the history of medicine.